Whatever you want to start.
Just go for it. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm going to host today's session. I'm Sufus Tuamgasan from the Nature Positive Hub. But today, it's really a massive pleasure to invite Dr. Brock Bergseth to come and speak today about the application of behavioural science to conservation. So Brock just finished a DECRA, a really prestigious fellowship over at James Cook University in Australia. Brock's now a visiting fellow here at the Interdisciplinary Centre for Conservation Science over in Department of Biology. I've been super interested in Brock's work for a really long time in the conservation sustainability space. There is absolutely no doubt that human behaviors are just deeply misaligned with sustainability outcomes. And in many places, straight up regulations don't work or are infeasible. And so we need to understand behavioral interventions to align human behavior with sustainability objectives. And that requires really rigorous science applied in cool context, often beyond the reach of regulation. And Brock's an expert on this. So Brock, thanks so much for being here. Brock's going to speak for about an hour, and then we have drinks afterwards in the Place Suite. So please welcome Brock.
Thanks, Sufus. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. I realize it's sunny outside, which is an even bigger ask than normal. So hopefully I can keep you a bit entertained. And rather than doing the traditional academic talk where I just talk about my research the whole time, I wanted to take this opportunity to really do a wide scan of what's been going on in behavioral science writ large, talk about a few different themes, some myths that we commonly encounter, and then some really great solutions that I think other people have been putting forward. And then I'll just briefly focus on a bit of the work that I've been doing in the last couple of years as well. So without further delay, perhaps it's best to define what behavioral science is. And put very simply, it's pretty much understanding what makes us as humans tick, what makes us get along or not, and how we can kind of try to shift people's behavior. And so one of the real kind of things that I run into is that there are so many different disciplines that call themselves something that has to do with the human behavioral science. And I've listed a few here on the bottom left side of the screen. But the take-home message here is that there's so much jargon and so many different approaches that this is often a bit counterproductive, in my opinion. So what I'm going to try to do today is really narrow down on kind of key concepts, key takeaways, and eliminate some of the jargon, or, you know, as best an academic can, keep it to a minimum. So before I talk about, you know, how did we get here, I heard a question a couple of weeks ago, and it really made me take pause and struck me as what a great opportunity as I was planning for this talk. And the question was, what has social science ever done for conservation? And, you know, typically social scientists might get a bit upset and say, well, what is conservation biology ever done for conservation, right? And rather than get territorial, I saw that as a great opportunity to really look back and try to convince an audience that maybe doesn't have much behavioral science or social science background about what exactly the tools that myself and others that are much more expert than I am work in day to day to try to deliver behavior change on the ground, and how these can be applied to conservation itself. So the first thing that social sciences can do for us is they can really help us take stock of how we got here to this moment now. Everyone in here is probably aware that we're in a crisis and that the world seems to be falling down around us. You know, this isn't a coincidence. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the political scientists and philosophers that have described why exactly we're here. I think most of us know general takeaways, but I want to talk about how you can actually systematically think about it and make sense of it in a way that we can then do something about it. And that's the most important part of behavioral science. So in 2000, Robert Putnam, American political scientist, wrote a very seminal book called Bowling Alone. And essentially his premise is that we, and especially Americans, have been bowling alone. And what he was describing here is a breakdown of social clubs and our social structure that support us in this case, American society. And he was referring to bowling clubs, which, as I was growing up, I was actually a member of a bowling club. So while I may be aging myself, it also kind of shows how quickly these norms that used to be, these norms and institutions that used to be like standard have disappeared almost overnight when we look at a timeline. And the result, or the kind of cause of this, was actually the invention of the television. The television then got so cheap that we could all take it into our homes. And then we became increasingly isolated as we dropped out of our social clubs, whether they were card clubs, whether they were religious clubs, whether they were church clubs, whether they were bowling clubs. And so we became increasingly isolated as we got addicted to a television rather than going out to find our interaction. Now, there's another political scientist called Michael Sandel, and he wrote a book called Democracy's Discontent. And this is a really interesting book because it really talks about this is not a coincidence of why we're here, and it describes why we're seeing some of the trends and this kind of right-shifting momentum that we're all kind of taking stock of as it's occurring kind of right under our feet. And his main premise is that we're in this failed legacy of neoliberal globalization. And what this did was it allowed the elites to really prosper. Those that had money prospered even more at the disadvantage of local workers, often individuals that don't have a college degree. And what this meant is that there was a lot of tension that started to evolve as the elites, and here I'm sitting in one of the most prestigious institutions of the world. So we would probably all be considered elites by the working class. The elites have, become successful while the working class has really kind of floundered and tried to just break even. And it's important to remember as well that in America, only 30% of people have a college degree. Now, this might be surprising to us, but when you think about that, that means 7 out of 10 people that you're going to run into on the street are not educated at college. This isn't a bad thing. Everyone has their own roles, but if we think that we here in these educational institutions understand the beat on the street, I think we're quite wrong, because as you see in this next kind of point, all of our public institutions that used to encourage this mixing of classes, of races, of people from different backgrounds have all eroded. And Mandel calls it the stadiumification of American society. And what he's referring to here is sports stadium used to be this place where everyone would go and they would mix. Everyone had a seat just like today. Now in the last 10 to 20 years, all these skyboxes have allowed the wealthy to essentially isolate themselves. So they're there at the game, but they're no longer mixing with people. And this is causing a breakdown even more of our social fabric. People are no longer coming together and having common understanding, and we're seeing increasing polarization on many issues. So our current reality is one where there are many shocks that are occurring, whether they're environmental, health, financial, and they're eroding people's resilience and really reducing our ability to kind of cope with a safety net around us. So let's talk about the legacy of behavioral sciences so far. Advertisers and marketers have been using behavioral sciences for decades. In fact, in many cases, they've been inventing it as they go. And the main message they often use is that you are not good enough as you are. And the answer to that is that you can go and buy more stuff to make you feel better, or to make you just as good as everyone else. Social media, mainstream media, of course, have been using cognitive behavioral science that leverages our evolutionary background and our hormonal pathways to keep us addicted to a 24 hours news cycle and doom scrolling, essentially, and again, increases polarization. And then finally, we know that multinationals are using behavioral sciences to deflect blame, to discredit scientists, and to generally try to divide us rather than keep us moving together in the right way. So I argue that we need to turn these tools to decent good. So I'm not sure if anyone has seen this article, but essentially in 2001, Vfluence was founded by the head of public relations at Monsanto. And what they did was they did psychographic profiling on all these individuals that did not like pesticides, so people that were against the use of pesticides. And they're using this information to target all of the academics, environmental activists, and everything else so that they could be harassed and so they could be discredited. This only recently got shut down, like less than a month ago, because finally the news broke that this was occurring, and they essentially faced so much public pressure that they decided to shut shop. The point I want to make here is this is 24 years that these guys have been operating. If you think these are the only people that are operating, I think we're, probably going to see plenty of these. And as long as we keep looking for them, they're going to pop up. But I really want to drive home that we as scientists need to know what we're up against as we're starting to operate in this space, and we cannot be naive about how behavioral science tools are being used against us at the moment. So let's talk a little bit more about how we can move forward and why does this matter? As Plato once said, those who tell the stories rule society. And I would suggest that we as scientists need to tell better stories. Doesn't mean they need to be false, they just need to be more strategic. And we need to think about how we're communicating, who we're communicating to, and what we want to drive home as far as action. So the last thing I'm going to kind of build you up with about our culture and the state that we're in is this idea of a scarcity mindset, the concept of relative deprivation, and this whole state of despondency. And the kind of take-home message here is that each of these different states that people commonly find themselves in, and especially millennials and Generation Zers, are not coincidence. They're states that essentially keep us isolated, keep us apathetic, keep us unable to make long-term strategic decisions, and essentially keep us in our cage. And this is what's happening. So it's no surprise that we are not seeing the effects that we want to see when we're going out there and we're talking about the science, and people just don't seem to be listening. When you're in a state of lack, the last thing that you can do is make a plan for 50 to 100 years from now. So you want to think about culture, think about it as a cumulative effect of many small actions. So small ripples are leading to big waves. And these are then considered culture, whether they're trends, whether they're fads, or if they become something that really becomes established a norm. And it takes time to change culture, but the way that we should focus as scientists is on the micro, because the micro leads to the macro. And when you focus on the micro, and you have rigorous, targeted, strategic efforts and interventions to address specific issues and specific populations, we can start moving the needle. But I'd say that we need to both understand the bigger system in which we are working in and really understand that targeting the general public just isn't going to cut it anymore. So perhaps this is no surprise to you, but I find myself having to say it again and again just because I want to make sure it's clear that the vast majority of problems in conservation today are caused by humans. And we often phrase humans as the problem, but we can also be the solution. So to me, I believe that conservation really means behavior change. And this is what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about. So a brief concept of systems thinking. Can we get a quick raise of hands to show how many people know what systems thinking is or how familiar they are with it? Great. So this is like more than half of you. So I'm going to kind of skim through. Essentially, what this does is it helps us break down a very complex system into small elements that we can then use to understand how things, and especially hidden dynamics like power dynamics or contextual factors or personal relationships, can be used to target interventions and to influence the system in which we're working. And if you see in the bottom right here, this is a Bayesian belief network, which is essentially a conceptual model of the world in Indonesia to understand customary marine tenure. And what they did was they looked at what influences the outcomes of customary marine tenure. And surprise, surprise, the most influential effect was actually that of local communities' perceptions of fish abundance. Not the actual quantitative abundance, but the perceptions of it. So again, this comes back to perceptions are reality and perceptions are driving the world much more than objective truth may be. And I want to remember that environmental issues are not happening in a silo. And there are human reasons that are driving them. And a great case study can be seen with illegal logging in Indonesia's national park called Gunung Palung. And in this case, an NGO worked for more than 10 years, and they did 400 hours of focus groups with 500 community representatives. All they did was listen. That was the whole thing that they were interested in doing. And rather than coming up with a solution before they started, we just need to tell people that illegal logging is bad. They said, okay, well, what's driving illegal logging? And they learned that the vast majority of people that were logging illegally were doing it because they didn't have money to access public health. So they went out and they designed an intervention that gave subsidized access to health clinics to communities. And most importantly, the cost or the subsidies in those communities were tied to the rate of illegal logging and deforestation in those areas. So that essentially made it to something where it wasn't like you could just sign up and say, I'm going to stop logging. You had to stop logging to get the subsidized access. But as far as what social science can do for us, I think this is probably one of the best results I've ever heard of, which was a 70% reduction in the illegal logging and 28,000 people with healthcare access. And this is all because people decided to listen rather than come up with a solution and implement immediately. Now, there was a dose-dependent effect, and I want to just highlight this briefly for a moment. And that's essentially that the more engagement individuals had with the intervention, the better the actual response was. And I'm going to come back to this again because it matters, and it's something that I want you to take away from today. Now, to move on a little bit, I want to talk a bit about population segmentation. This is something that is very much standard use in behavioral sciences, and this is essentially dividing a population, not a system, into smaller groups, and this can be based on shared values, shared occupations, traits, beliefs, behaviors, any way you want to cut the pie to try to understand what's going on, who's driving it, and who we need to speak to. And this allows us to target communication efforts specific to each group or the group of most concern or impact. And so a great example of this has been done by Yale's program on climate change communication. And if you look on the bottom left corner of the screen, you'll see that they essentially segmented the population into 6 categories. And this was people that were alarmed about global warming and climate change, people that were concerned, all the way down to those that were dismissive. So this is one way of starting to cut the pie to understand who we need to communicate with and how we can try to shift them into different categories. Now, what they did on the top right corner was essentially a normative intervention that was around correcting misperceptions about scientific consensus. And what they did was they figured out that essentially people had misperceptions around how much agreement there was in science about climate change. And when they went out with the message that 97% of scientists agreed that climate change or global warming was caused by humans, they saw huge swings in people's belief around that scientific consensus. And most interestingly, if you look at the map of the United States here, you can see that West Virginia, North Dakota, and Wyoming, all of which are typically very conservative states, swung the most, which is quite cool. So we've segmented our population, and now we just need to tell them, right? We just need to give them the facts, the objective truth, and people will change their behaviors. This makes me think about the famous quote by Mark Twain, because I feel like it is so applicable here to us in conservation science today. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And I think as conservation scientists, oftentimes we just think we give an objective truth and it changes people's behavior, but it doesn't. So that brings me into the myth that I really want to try to bust today, and that is that of the information deficit communication model. And this is essentially the idea that all we need to do to change people's behavior is tell them more about that specific issue. Let's tell them about the scientific rationale. Let's tell them why marine protected areas work. Let's tell them why they matter. Let's tell them how important it is that they care about it. And the problem is that raising awareness does not change behavior. It's only the first step, but awareness does not change behavior. So I want you to remember that as well. It's been disproven countless times for environmental behaviors, and efforts to actually do this can actually be seen as patronizing and or manipulative. Remember that we are seen as the elite. And so when we're talking to the common public, they may not appreciate us trying to tell them what's right or how they're wrong. And a great example of that is here in the UK, where there's been serious pushback or blowback against efforts to reduce meat consumption. So I want to just kind of drive home some of the key themes that we often try to communicate. We've destroyed our planet. Animal populations have steadily declined for decades despite best efforts. Funding for ESG or sustainable finance is at all-time low. We're in a blank crisis. How we communicate it is not the way that it's received by our audience, and people rarely take time to check to make sure that the message that was communicated was received. So oftentimes it can be, we're doomed, why bother, there's no hope, or maybe I should just get mine, while there's still some out there, right? These are the problems that we're facing. So if we think about storytelling, and I think this is something that we really need to focus more on, and we think about a story arc. If you look at the story arc above, you see that we have a bunch of different stages before we hit a climax, and then we come down to a resolution. I would suggest that conservation scientists often get stuck at the inciting incident. We went out, we found a huge problem. And then at the very end of the paper, they say, and this has important implications for management, right? Like everyone has read that. But I would suggest that instead, we actually need to just get even one step further, which is here are potential solutions, we're working to address the issue, or people are alarmed and engaged. Most of these are probably true, but we're not thinking strategically about how we're doing our research in the first place and how we need to communicate that to affect change. So now let's talk a little bit about the science of communication. And I've listed some examples here that I want to talk about today. The first is about message framing, or essentially making sure your message is tailored to your audience. Hint here, know your audience in the first place. The second is around this idea of legacy primes, which are often very powerful for environmental behaviors. The third is that we need to use rigorous social science to underpin communication efforts. And at the risk of being potentially contentious, what I want to say here, as somebody who sits on both sides of the camp, is that we wouldn't assume that social scientists are good at doing population biology or ecology studies. So we should assume the same as vice versa. Ecologists and population biologists should not be doing social science communication work. This is a great time for us to come together and collaborate across the disciplines, and I don't think we're seeing enough of it. And hopefully, some of these interdisciplinary kind of arrangements are increasing our ability to do so. Now, I want to also remind you that people are social creatures, and we should leverage social norms. So I'll drop into that in a little bit. But the last thing to remember here is that an information source is often the most important aspect of communication writ large. So how many people in the room are familiar with later is too late? Has anyone come across this before? Great, not a single hand. This is novel and new. So this is a group that has been essentially put together by the Potential Energy Coalition. And this is essentially a marketing organization, NGO in the United States. They used to do standard marketing, and now they've switched into climate science. And they've done some really fascinating stuff in collaboration with a couple of different universities in the United States. And I'm going to just touch on a few of them today. The first is that an urgent generational message, or what we would call a legacy prime, is very powerful. And as you can see above, where the triangles are the people that were exposed to that message. And on the y-axis is the proportion of people who strongly agree with immediate government action on climate. And you can see that cuts all the way across. So they looked at, I think it was 18 different policies and how you frame them, with 60,000 people from across 23 countries, which essentially is a representative sample of about 70% of the world's population. So this is something that unifies across the board. Essentially, think about your kids, think about the next generation, and things are urgent. We need to get moving. To go a little bit further and you look into the framing, the legacy prime, as I told you, was important, but it was actually 12 times more powerful than this common thing that we hear all the time that are rolled out by politicians or economists about creating growth or creating jobs, right? Everyone has seen this on a political debate time and time again. But if we can think about how we harness these kinds of inherent wirings of us, of we humans, we can actually start shifting things quite quickly. And this was actually effective for all ideologies across the aisle and across the United States. So this is really exciting stuff. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about framing here is this idea that there are different types of frames. So when you look at the top, the support of 54% was essentially a frame that said, you know, research shows that homes with gas have high air pollution, so we should ban it. The next message that got way more uptake was the idea that the same message, they have air pollution, but we should use the latest clean technology. You know, we humans love technology. So figuring out how to kind of leverage that for behavior change is great. Finally, if you add in this idea that typically speaks very well to Republicans or fiscal conservatives, is the idea that it also saves us energy and money. So if you can see there, they're kind of spreading their message across all these different camps and hoping that something will kind of grab each individual along the way. And I would suggest that we as conservation scientists, myself included, need to stop what is perceived as virtue signaling and talking about the morality of, you know, protecting nature just for nature's sake, because it's not always the most effective way of doing it. And we need to think a bit more about strategic messages that cut across all these different ideologies. Because sometimes talking about the inherent value of nature, while we all believe it and while I believe it to the depth of my heart, is not going to influence somebody that cares about money or making, the next million, or, kind of putting food on the table. So we need to think a bit more strategically. Now, as far as strategy goes, I want to share an example that's very close to my heart, because this was done by a close mentor of mine, and you won't find it in any real published studies out there. But in the late 90s, Lindblad expeditions in the Galapagos really wanted to try to increase philanthropic donations by people on these boats that were going as tourists to the Galapagos. And so they contacted my mentor, Professor Emeritus Sam Ham from the University of Idaho, real name, to tell you the truth. And what he did was he designed a strategy that was aimed at influencing beliefs. And so hopefully you're at least somewhat familiar here with the theory of planned behavior in the bottom right corner, but this is one of the most validated, empirically proven theories of human behavior that's in use in social psychology today. And what he really did was he focused on beliefs. So he went out and he asked about all the salient beliefs. What do you think will happen if you donate? Is it good or bad? What do you think other people will care about if you donate? And then finally, he asked about factors that could make it easy or hard to donate. And there's a lot more effort and time that went into this than I'm giving it credit for. But essentially what happened was that they had a 272% increase in weekly donations in the first year. So they went from 1,800 per week to 6,700 per week. And all they did was they added some messages into the typical interpretation that guides were doing on the boat anyways. So they kept the experience almost the exact same, dropped a few key messages in there, used the dark arts of social science, and managed to really generate income. And so to this day, I think the estimates are around 12 to 15 million that they have raised for the Galapagos Conservation Fund. So I told you earlier that information source matters. And a great case study here is in India, where there is these persistent pockets of polio that really kind of continued to stay because communities were at least hesitant about vaccination programs or perhaps didn't believe in vaccinations. And so public health officials recognized that they weren't getting any traction there. So they sent community volunteers to go out on this listening campaign. And because they used community volunteers that were known in the communities in which they were working, they were able to build trust quite quickly. And they were able to really hear what was going on in the background. And they leveraged that network and personal interactions to the point where 2 years later, they completely eradicated polio. And this was something that was taking them decades to try to get down, and they couldn't just quite get rid of it, right? And basically, they managed to build trust through those community volunteers. They showcased some early progress to establish a social norm, and then they leveraged that into a tipping point. And, I take heart from reading this message because I think this is something that I hope we'll be able to say within our lifetime, which is, it seemed impossible until it was done. And so if we can take a little bit of encouragement from somebody that's working on eradicating such a horrible disease and such a challenging developing economy, I think we could move forward and keep a bit of optimism as we're going about our day in this increasingly volatile world I told you about. I want to change topic a little bit now to talk about the science of influencing politicians, because this is something that we all recognize perhaps science needs to be better at, and we don't really know what to do about it. And I was at Sir Ian Boyd's book launch talk a couple of weeks ago at the Oxford Martin School, and the takeaway message was that politics is about people, and science is about objectivity and objective truth. And there's a huge mismatch there. And the real problem to my eyes, as I previously worked as a philanthropic funder in a different lifetime, is that we don't have slush funds, or we don't have funds that are made available to us to go and develop relationships and close relationships with policymakers. So because we don't have that, and because it comes out of our own pocket if we're proactively going out and doing that, instead we hope in vain that maybe we can write a brilliant policy brief of 2 pages, and we'll hope that it has some sort of an effect. And that's if we write one, because I haven't written that many policy briefs. What about the rest of us here, right? Like, this is not something that we're incentivized to do, because policy briefs don't get you a publication. They don't get you a citation. They're probably not going to get you more research funding. So there's systematic problems here. But I really want to drive home the idea that we have to realize that even if we write the best policy brief ever and we get it in the right hands at the right time, science still may not carry the day. So I would argue that we need to spend a lot more time understanding how politicians make decisions and how to more effectively engage and influence them. So a few things about politicians. Let's understand the world that they work in. They make decisions in what we call noisy environments, under time pressure. They often rely on what we call heuristics or cognitive biases, like shortcuts in thinking just quickly, moving through stuff. They're also, to give them credit, they're also working in a place where there's probably never going to be anyone that's satisfied with an outcome or a decision that they make. So they're always kind of bound to voters' wishes and lobby groups. And they tend to prefer personal experiences, anecdotes, and simplifications. So again, I'll bring up an American example. Abraham Lincoln was always known for essentially always having an anecdote, that really drove the point home with a little bit of humor, and he managed to always go across the aisle that way. And I think when you think about how a politician is trying to communicate, how they're trying to move, how they're trying to essentially use personal favors and a lot of history in a space, if they've been there long enough, you understand how they start making change happen, rather than focusing on objective truths and the science says this, so we need to do this. Instead, they're perhaps saying, what does the average Joe from place X think of this issue? And if I make this decision, is it going to cost or win me votes? This is kind of how they're starting to think about things. So maybe as scientists, instead, we could say, the best science says this, or perhaps even more effectively, and what colleagues in Australia have been doing, is telling them specifically about what their demographic thinks about this issue. So this percentage of people in your constituency or in your district think that this is what should happen. That is very straightforward, guiding kind of politicians into making the decisions that science perhaps supports. But it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without strategy in the first place. So now I want to move on to another potential example that I think we really need a push in, and that's around this idea of framing sustainable investments. And I want to drive home this idea that charismatic language and optimistic frames matter. So there was a study that was done years ago, and they essentially had a group of telemarketers, and one group had a picture of somebody crossing a finish line with their arms raised high, and the other group just had a regular picture of someone running. And the individuals that had that picture of arms raised high and a bit of charismatic language were much more effective at making sales and closing sales than those that just had a picture. And while there are many other examples of this, I'm going to move forward, but optimistic, charismatic language matters. And investment professionals may use sophisticated approaches, but they're also humans. And that means that they are also subject to the same kind of heuristics or shortcuts in cognition that we know of in the rest of the human population. So in this study below on the bottom right corner, they essentially went through and they put a recipe together, and they said, we're going to use optimistic framing. We're going to emphasize the transitory nature of cost for investing responsibly or sustainably. And we're going to really emphasize the permanency of future benefits. And what they managed to do is increase responsible investments by about 3.6%. And that may not sound like a lot until you think about what the global value of professionally managed assets are, which is around 98 trillion US. So this represents a potential gain of almost 3.6 in responsible investments. And if you take away anything else from me today, it's that humans are social creatures and we follow trends. And so if we start a trend, who knows how quickly it can happen. And I'm going to touch base on that a little bit more. But before I get there, I want to talk very quickly about a concept called behavioral spillover. And this is focused on the individual level. And essentially what the idea behind this is that if you can promote simple and easy behavior as entry points into what I call the conveyor belt of sustainable behavior, you can use these catalytic or wedge behaviors to get people on board and start moving in a more sustainable direction. So typically this has been researched in kind of like and like behaviors. So if somebody turns off a water tap, they're more likely to potentially install more efficient washing machines. And there's good empirical evidence for this. But I would suggest that it's also likely to work across behaviors. There just hasn't been a lot of people researching this yet. So anyone looking for a great PhD or postdoc idea, you don't have to pay me for this. I'll give it to you for free. In Maine, researchers looked at this idea of green consumerism. So essentially people that made some sort of sustainable financing choice in their day-to-day lives. And they actually were able to predict the acceptance of wind power. So this does cut across some behaviors, and I'd suggest that it probably cuts across more. But it's important to consider these ideas of self-efficacy, the ease of adoption, the risks and the consequences of doing these behaviors, because they're probably also likely to be important. Okay, now we're in the home stretch, and I'm going to talk to you about something that's very close to my heart and kind of where my research tends to focus these days. And that's the idea that humans are social creatures. So social norms can be defined as essentially formal and informal rules that shape our societies. And cooperation and following the norm were believed to be very evolutionarily advantageous until they weren't, until we're at this point now where we're all following like lemmings off the hill in our consumeristic lifestyle at the cost of our planet's health and our potential future. So the problem is that many of the issues we're dealing with today as far as social norms go is misperceptions, and this is of course increasing as misinformation or disinformation is also increasing. There's a couple of ones that I want to just quickly touch on, and those are the false consensus effect and pluralistic ignorance. So the false consensus effect happens when somebody engages in a socially undesirable or illegal behavior. Let's say drink driving, let's say smoking marijuana, let's say bank fraud, any of these things. And what happens is individuals that engage in these types of activities actually have a higher estimate of the prevalence of that activity in the rest of the population. The problem with that is that it essentially allows them to justify the continued behavior that they're doing. Now, if you take a step back, there's something called pluralistic ignorance. I told you I was going to try to cut down on the jargon, and so this is going to be some of the last stuff here. But this is the concept, and it's kind of, they call it often a bedfellow that exists with false consensus effect. But this is the idea that while I may not do a behavior, the rest of the public is doing it. And because of that, the danger is that I may change my behavior to kind of follow suit with this misperception. So a great example of this was binge drinking in college students. College students increasingly were starting to binge drink because they thought that everyone else was. They went out and they did a normative intervention, said, well, you know, actually the data shows that not that many people are binge drinking, and what do you know? Binge drinking dropped quite quickly. So the goal often in this kind of work is to establish either new norms or to correct harmful misperceptions of norms. And I want to talk to you about social contagion theory and social tipping points, because I think they are perhaps some of the most valid dynamics or valid ways of viewing the world that we exist in today. Social contagion theory essentially takes a disease epidemiology approach to understanding the transfer of norms or ideas through society. And social tipping points is just the same thing that we all probably know about ecological tipping points. We're in a system and the state of the system stays steady, 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 and then suddenly we tip into a whole new system or a whole new basin in this case. And what research has found consistently, for the most part, is that strongly networked minority groups that are on the fringe of societies can actually tip or flip societal norms, almost what seems to be overnight. And this kind of level of tipping occurs at roughly 15 to 30% of the population. And so when you look back with this kind of lens, you start to understand why things like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, or even the latest US election resulted in the way that they did. People were networked, the light was shown on them, and they waited for their spark point, and they managed to flip the norm. So these things can both work for good and for bad. It just depends on how we leverage these for conservation science. Now, the last thing I kind of want to really drive home here is that norms often work unconsciously rather than consciously. So they're often underappreciated forms of social influence, and I'll dig into that a little bit more. Now, this is a great example of how this kind of work can be put into place in the real world. And this was done by the NGO called RARE, based out of the United States. And they were trying to figure out how to get farmers to use more sustainable farming methods. And they decided on a kind of fairly easy approach, which was first you start by finding what we call early adopters, or people that are more likely to adopt the behavior without too much of a push. And then you showcase those adopters in the rest of the community and evidence of their success to essentially build what we call social proof. And then when you take that social proof, you can leverage both the early adopters and kind of like the mid-resistance farmers, they call it in this case, along with that evidence. And then you use that to kind of build this widespread expectation that's coming from their peers, not just from you, an external NGO, that there is social pressure for this behavior change. And the last thing that I want to kind of really drive home here is that you need to reinforce often for what we call norm stability, because one of the key caveats and certainly the best criticisms of social norm interventions is that you make an intervention, you bump the norm, maybe you get a 20% increase in a behavior that you want, and then suddenly it drops back off again. And that's because we're not going back in time and time again to reinforce the norm. So if you can build that into your intervention, or if you can figure out a way to build that into your community population, you have a much higher chance of really changing that norm in the long term. Now, to keep you on your feet, I want to use an example that's close to home. Did you guys know that Oxford academics are increasingly drinking decaffeinated rather than caffeinated coffee? Why do you think this is? Anyone have ideas? I'll farm it out to the audience. Anyone brave?
For better sleep.
Yeah, for better sleep. Anyone else? Theories? Yeah.
It's more widely available.
Great. So this is a trick question. And essentially what happens here is this is what's called a self-persuading norm. I have no idea whether people are drinking more caffeinated or decaffeinated coffee. But this is an example that's been used just recently to get people to buy one color of a jug of detergent rather than another in a department store. And essentially what they did, or what this is a dynamic descriptive norm. So this is what other people are doing, and they're increasingly doing it. So I'm describing a trend in the population. And the most important part here is I used a self-persuading norm. I ask you to tell me why you think that's occurring. So instead what that does is it shortcuts past your ability to think critically about why it may be occurring or if it's true. And essentially you're trying to figure out a rationalization for why it's happening. So research has shown that this is really influential in changing normative kind of perceptions amongst people. And I'm going to tell you why I focused on this here today rather than just tricking you with a trick question. So the way that or the kind of context in which I work most often with human behavior science is to try to understand illegal fishing and poaching in marine protected areas. It's a very pervasive issue, it's persistent, and it's often very difficult for us to shift. And the problem is that there is an over-reliance on inherently limited enforcement capacity to increase compliance. So people are always thinking, we just need more enforcement, we need more enforcement, we need more enforcement. But I think we all know that the stick only works for so long and that the carrot is a much better incentive to get people to do what we want them to do. So this kind of gap that I've identified is, how can we actually reduce poaching in the absence of drastically increased enforcement capacity, which is not realistic in the world today. So I had two kind of main research questions that I've been investigating in the last couple of years. And the first is, do social norms influence poaching in marine protected areas? And the second is, can we use social norms-based behavioral interventions to reduce illegal fishing? And the sub-question here related to what I just tried to trick you with earlier is, what's the most powerful type of normative message that we could use? So I'm going to share with you some very preliminary results. I'm not going to give you p-values, but I'm going to give you general trends and tell you to hopefully expect this out in the literature sometime soon. So what we did is we used experimental gains from experimental psychology to essentially engage fishers in the field to understand what drives them to behave legally or illegally as far as it comes to fishing in a marine protected area, no-take marine protected area, or in a legal fishing area. And this really helped us avoid the trap of using students from weird countries, because in experimental psychology, the vast majority of your research population is college students in a Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, I think it is, economy. So we used two different games here. And in the first game, we used fishers plus computer confederates or bots. So this is quite a bit of deception again. If you're not realizing what I do, I think you probably are now. And we really wanted to kind of use pre-programmed behavioral profiles in those bots and put people in different treatments to see whether that norm influenced their own decision making. And so we'd put them in 5 different treatments, and if this could be anything from a control to a high compliance treatment, a low compliance treatment, a low to high, or a high to low. And overall, what we found was that the predisposition, or what they decided to do in a practice round with no consequences, and social norms of these confederates, which in this case was a bot and not real, but we told them it was real, was the most powerful predictor of Fisher's decisions. And we kept enforcement constant. And in this case, it kind of allows you to see that causally norms are driving behavior outside of anything else. And then in the second game that we did, we used real Fishers in a group setting, so no more deception here. But we did hit them with a normative intervention. And if you see in the bottom right corner, our message was a bit of deception. More and more anglers choose not to fish in green zones. This is on the Great Barrier Reef. A green zone is a no-take zone. And don't think others should either. Why do you think this is? And the really interesting thing is if you look at the red line, this is where we hit them with a normative message. You see a fairly decent, substantial change in behavior. And the most interesting thing that we've been finding so far as we start digging into this data is that people who were convinced, so we asked them after the game, did the message change your behavior? People that were convinced that the message did not change their behavior tended to show the most change in their behavior. So, you know, because we did this causally and we eliminated all other aspects, there was no communication, there was no feedback, all they saw was other people's behaviors throughout the game and the message, we know that essentially that normative message has shifted behavior. And we're now at the point where we're going to start building models to examine whether or not social tipping points could potentially exist based on this data that we have. We've currently collected this data both in Australia and Chile, and we'll hopefully be collecting it in Papua New Guinea or the Philippines as well, which will allow us to look at these kind of interventions not only on a cultural gradient, whether it's, you know, collectivistic versus individualistic, whether it's tight or loose kind of countries, but it also allows us to look and see if there's differences between recreational fishers in Australia, recreational fishers in Chile, artisanal fishers in Chile, or artisanal fishers in Papua New Guinea. So this is work that's ongoing, but I wanted to just give you a quick preview of the work that I've been doing along with my PhD student, Stuart Jones at James Cook University. So without further delay, I'll wrap up. I think I'm at 57 minutes, so we're doing well here. I want you to remember a few key important points. Conservation means behavior change. Behavioral sciences are still relatively untapped for conservation science. And this is partly, in my mind, due to a lack of cross-disciplinary collaboration. We need to embrace the science of storytelling. We really need to dig in on this more because oftentimes, as you know, scientists today, we're told not only do you do the research, not only do you do the funding, you also have to do the public communication. You also have to do this, 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 this. But I think the most important thing for us to be focusing on is the power of storytelling and how we can use our science to influence real-world change. I just want to leave you with this idea that legacy primes, norms, and relatively small changes in the micro can lead to big changes that shift cultures in the macro. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and offer any questions.
That was such a good talk. Thank you so much, Brock. Okay, so we'll open up to questions. Are we doing online questions or not?
There may be some.
There may be some. Yeah, so are there any questions from the audience for starters? Yes, please.
If I bring the mic round to you, just the online people can then hear your questions. Sorry, thanks.
You like it? Thanks, man.
I actually have a question. Is that on? Yeah. My question is more to do with just behavior. And for instance, in Texas, where the measles outbreak has happened and non-adoption of vaccination, parents actively saying vaccinations are bad. And now you have the changes at the FDA. How would you approach that problem? I know that's not environmental, but it's still behavioral.
It's a great question. And I think the first way that we start approaching it is to understand what's happening. So there's almost certainly a vested interest that's operating there that is driving this kind of distrust among scientists. And maybe it's not about vaccines, but it's driving that distrust in general. So if I was the strategist behind trying to make that kind of trying to address that issue, I would get scientists out into public venues and public forums where they could engage with average people. And obviously this is becoming very contentious, but many issues are becoming very contentious. And it's because we're all existing in these silos and these echo chambers. So there's a lot of work that's being done by kind of other NGO groups that's essentially, rather than engaging scientists about vaccines with vaccine deniers, let's find something that they share in common. This could be a recreational activity. This could be, fishing, woodworking, farming, gardening, any of these kinds of things. And what they're finding is when they bring people from urban centers that tend to be liberal, and they engage with people from rural areas that tend to be conservative, is that they're actually reducing a lot of polarization. So they're essentially trying to reinvent the social institutions that allow us to mix. And I think that that's probably the most likely way to start affecting change immediately, outside of potentially using that example that I showed you from India, where they're eradicating polio.
Thanks, Brock. Great, great talk. I was wondering, kind of building on what you were just talking about there, if you could link sort of some of the things you said early in the talk with the later part of the talk, because I'm hearing, so I heard the very strong message about polio and listening. And then later on, really more about, let's say, a little bit of social engineering, a little bit of manipulation as a way of sort of tipping points, getting people to go the way that we want them to, whatever that might be. But as you pointed out also, that can just as easily tip back or it can go in the directions we don't want. So I'm just wondering, in terms of sustainable long-term solutions, how important is the listening? Because, for example, following on that, there are reasons why, the illegal fishing is happening. Maybe people are starving, maybe, so how important is the listening versus getting people to do what we want them to do based on what our perceptions of what needs to be done? Because I think there maybe is some tension there. I don't know what
Of course there is, yeah. And, just to be clear, I think one of the big problems in conservation science today is that we in the Western economies, developed economies, are telling people in developing economies in the global South what they need to be doing. So the way that I try to really kind of put myself into this debate is to consider myself as a scientific service provider for people that have changes that they want to see. So the first thing is to start listening. So often what I'll do is I'll go and have coffee, kava, a beer, whatever else with fishers, ask them what's going on, if there's any interest, if illegal fishing is a problem. And if it's a problem and they don't want to do anything with it, that's their realm. So leave it be. And maybe somewhere down the line they do. But by listening, that allows us to build trust and build rapport. And I think that's something that is absolutely lacking in general in conservation science, because there's so much pushback against parachute science, this, history of colonialism, and it's all rightly so. So the last thing that we should be doing is going in and just doing manipulations with people that don't welcome it in the first place, that don't want it to be there, and aren't going to potentially take up the behavior anyways. So that's my first answer. My second answer is essentially, when I spoke about all the societal and big macro culture problems, what I was trying to get, really drive home here is that we're, for the most part, many people are starting to exist in a short-term planning horizon because we're in scarcity, deprivation, and we're shut down and despondent. And any sort of long-term planning is not going to work. So any sort of message about you need to plan long-term, it's not going to happen. So there's this thing called the vividness intervention. And they've used this in public health, smoking cessation, financial planning, a bunch of different kind of contexts, where they essentially guide people through a visualization of the future that they want to see. And it's not more than, it's not 25 minutes, but it's maybe just really think about that future that you want to see and what you're doing in that future. And when they do something like that, they call it a prime typically, that actually results in people making much longer, more stable or sustainable decisions. So in a case where people are absolutely starving in a developing economy, let's say a country in Africa where they are just right on the edge of poverty. Of course, you don't want to come in and try to tell them that extra fish that you're taking, don't take it, because, if they don't take it, somebody else will. And in those cases, that's extreme deprivation or absolute deprivation, not relative. So in that case, you have a very different set of tools, and that's, poverty alleviation, that is going across from looking at an environmental issue and looking at a public health issue like that illegal logging example that I showed you. And I think this is where we can learn a lot from public health and in this kind of realm where they regularly encounter these super wicked, pervasive issues that have human lives at stake, and where we can learn kind of the best of intervention science and how to roll those out in ways that are ethically and morally sound. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brock. This is super, super comprehensive and thoughtful. So many of the examples that you gave across public health, responsible investing, there's another one. Oh, and reducing energy usage. I think one big distinction from those applications versus conservation is that there's kind of this personal individual benefit that can be gained from getting vaccinated or changing your investment strategy or reducing your energy usage. But in a lot of conservation challenges, and the example that you're working on with illegal fishing, it seems like there's not really individual benefit other than potentially this goal of being like altruistic and having any positive benefits from that. But do you see that as kind of like a fundamental barrier to applying some of the strategies that you mentioned for conservation? And if not, like what changes? How can we overcome that distinction?
Great question. Yeah. So in fisheries context, we used to kind of refer to this as what is commonly called the Valley of Doom. So you have a fishery stock, it's overexploited. You need to stop exploiting that for a period of time. You have to, essentially, fishers have to stop fishing. And that means that they have typically, it's about 5-year period where they're no longer able to fish what they typically were, and they're no longer able to derive income from that. But we know that, based on fisheries science, you stop fishing it, that stock is going to rebound to where you're going to catch more in the future, right? And it's also going to probably be more sustainable. So your children are going to have a fishery to fish. And fishers, the kind of like main thing that I think oftentimes we don't realize is that fishing is a lifestyle. Like, it is absolutely a cornerstone of someone's identity. So to tell them to stop fishing is like telling you to stop breathing, to stop doing conservation. It's not going to work. So in those contexts, what they often do is that they have people switch over to fishing a different type of fish, right? And this leads to a lot of other pervasive outcomes, like if you're giving them gear to target something deeper, you're giving them motors so they can go up further to target pelagics. And it opens up kind of, the genie's bottle. But the kind of takeaway for me is that, and again, I want to emphasize that I'm a scientist from a Western developed economy. So for me to tell them not to fish, I would never go and do this, by the way. For me to tell somebody not to fish and that it's going to be okay in the future is, it's fraught with all sorts of issues. But the science shows that if we give just a little bit of a break, that fisheries really, in marine protected areas specifically, everyone has this idea that you're locking up a space, but spillover, larval spillover, and spillover of larger adults increase fishing catch to the point where if you go to some of these marine protected areas in the Philippines or in other parts of Southeast Asia, you see everyone fishing the line. And that's because they know that those fish are coming out of that area and they're supplementing the fishery itself. So to me, it's more about figuring out why people might care and why people might be interested in reducing the amount of fishing, and then making sure that that behavior spreads throughout the population. Because, Elinor Ostrom has a whole huge seminal body of work that's around why people don't fall into this tragedy of the commons that was coined by Garrett Hardin. And that's a lot of the institutional kind of conditions and what is in a community that leads them to actually manage their resources sustainably. So there's a lot of information from there. And I'm not an Ostrom scholar, but I've dabbled in it a little bit to appreciate just the depth of field. But the kind of one thing I want to emphasize about Ostrom's framework is that it is not seen as a framework for solutions for an issue. It's more of a, this is the theory and this is describing why these places may not be falling into this common trap, rather than all you need to do is change this, this, and this. Does that make sense? It's not a diagnostic problem-solving framework, if that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to online questions and then next one's here. You've got some strong questions here. So 2 in a row. I fear that people with malign intents might also use social science like this. You described that in your talk. Do you think we risk an arms race between progressive and regressive uses of social science like this? And a follow-up is, could advanced AIs or those who program them become devastatingly good at behavioral manipulation using the approaches that you've described today?
100%. We're already in an arms race. We're losing. You know, like this is actually what's happening. And I remember reading an article maybe a month or two ago that was talking about the future and how AI, which they're using in social media, has massive databases to be able to predict human behavior. Like this stuff is already happening, you know. And if you think it isn't being used against us, go out and look. You know, it's happening. It's happening all the time, and we don't even know it's occurring because we're not looking for it. Or, yeah, I know that Instagram's going to give me an A or a B type of experiment to figure out which one's going to keep me doom scrolling. But they're using, like, that is just the surface of the issue. And until we engage with the system in which we're working, and until we figure out how to use the same tools that are being used against us to try to do some good, ethically, morally, you know, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, they do not need ethics approval for anything. I can tell you right now, the amount of ethics approval that I have gone through in my universities would make everyone quit. Nobody would want to do what I do because it's like months to years of getting ethics approval. So, you know, we're in this race. We have to figure out how to morally and ethically use these tools, because if we don't, we're going to get left behind, and AI is only going to increase the advantage because they have unlimited budgets compared to a university researcher like myself.
Yeah, and the role of advanced AIs at actually using these tools themselves.
Yeah, so I think
I interpreted that as like the use of large language models to actually write the question, for example, or design the interventions.
yeah, so I think it's probably going to happen within the next year or two, to be honest, from what I've been reading. And I'm not an expert on AI, but I think you know, all of us are going to be surprised at how quickly these things evolve. The one thing that I do know about large language models is if you give them enough time, they tend to degrade over time, right? So they kind of have their own Achilles heel, and hopefully that occurs here. But there's already firms I can guarantee you that are looking into how to use AI to build predictive psychological models, and they're using it to do things like sell us consumer items or God knows what else. Hopefully nothing more insipid than that. But yeah, it's occurring.
You've mentioned a lot about like knowing your audience and kind of framing or adapting the storytelling to meet them where they like to know what they know. And obviously listening is a big part of it. But how do you know that, you know, what you're listening is not just from this group of fishermen, for example, you're meeting, but really scalable across like all the fishermen around there? Or, you know, what are maybe metrics or more scalable ways of like understanding your audience?
I think it's a great question. And one of the things that I commonly encounter is, if you remember the example of 6 types of Americas, I think it's great that we've gotten there, but that does not allow us to figure out where these people live, where they get their information from, you know, like what their values are. And so like in political science, they call this like psychographic profiling. Where do their kids go to school? What are their recreational activities? What, you know, like where do they shop? Like what do they eat? Like all of these things, they know. Places like Vfluence, no, right? And so I wouldn't advocate doing this on a large level for any sort of kind of purpose, and especially without ethics approval. But the first thing is to think about what's going to help you kind of target your interventions most precisely and accurately. So for me, when I was thinking about illegal fishing on the Great Barrier Reef, I wanted to know, where are they getting their information from? Is it on Facebook? Is it on radio? Is it on television? Is it somewhere else? Is it people they know? And you know, then you can ask a series of questions that are essentially helping you learn more about their background. So obviously, I think you can appreciate that somebody that has a high school education versus somebody that has a graduate education is going to decipher messages very differently. And so when you can kind of start digging into the nuance, and what I often try to do is triangulate, because every method, every kind of way that you're going about looking at stuff is going to have bias, and it's going to be limited. So if you use 3 different methods to try to kind of get in there and understand it, you know, like, oh, I want to look at the average offender who isn't going to change his behavior by a normative intervention, and I want to understand what kind of a message might, you know, increase their compliance level. And similarly, I want to know, in this region, you know, how many are there? Who are they? You know, like that kind of a thing. So not who are they by name, but I think you kind of get the idea. Like, it's kind of like, you know, I remember science is once described as fumbling around in the dark and dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And there's a lot of that that goes into social science, but there's some tried and true kind of methods that can help you start to understand things. As far as scalability, I think essentially thinking about representative samples, stratification, areas of most focus, and then kind of like that example that I gave you about how the message from later is too late cut across all ideologies. They knew that there are different ideologies out there and they tested it across all of them. Maybe that's not possible with, you know, a university research budget, but I think these are the kinds of collaborative projects that we need to be aiming for because they're the ones that are going to start shifting behavior on a macro scale. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe just following on from that question and then perhaps also relating it back to the collaboration between conservationists and social scientists. A lot of this work needs to be done by sort of other people, right? Other, in your case, social scientists in collaboration with conservationists. But these are also roles that conservation organizations can play, politicians themselves. Could you just tell us a little bit of the story of how people who aren't in conservation but are doing conservation, say, might approach these kind of questions?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess to kind of change your question a little bit, what's my theory of change there? You know, as a researcher, I try to make myself available to conservation organizations to say, hey, this is what I do. Is it of interest? I'd be happy to share some knowledge or time. Going beyond a publication, like a primary peer-reviewed publication is the first step because the vast majority of practitioners that I know never have time or access to primary publications. So writing in the conversation, for instance, is an incredibly effective way of starting to reach out. And that often gets taken up by the news. So I try to be as active as I can with media releases through university offices as well. I'm not active on social media to my own detriment, but I think that's another way. You know, if you think of like the big kind of things that have changed public opinion, at least, or raised like serious consideration and awareness about problems, whether it's documentaries on Netflix like The Octopus Teacher, Seaspiracy, you know, these are kind of attempts at making change in the large scale. So I think there's a lot to be learned from what worked there and what didn't work. But there's a lot of stuff that, like, for instance, RARE, the NGO organization that specializes in behavior change, does, and they put a lot of this stuff out there in reports that are not primary peer-reviewed publications that are inaccessible. So I think their model is perhaps the best that I've seen so far in making these types of things available to the general practitioner, the average person that wants to learn more.
That's perfect. We have time for one more question, or we could go and have drinks 3 minutes early if you would like.
Who's got the doozy? There's one more in here.
There's one more. Yeah.
Nick.
Hey, Barack, thanks a lot. I think there's a line attributable to H.L. Mencken that American journalists never let the facts get in the way of a good story. I want to ask you about facts and honesty. And it seems that these kind of systems are vulnerable to players that are going to be a little bit, aggressive with facts or non-facts. Is there a case, are there cases where norms can change, where a priori it was what changed the norm where actually things were not true? Or what is the vulnerability of these systems to having mis or disinformation coming in that will change norms?
I think as we're in this modern era where social media is driving more and more people are getting their information from social media rather than from a traditional news media outlet. Whether that's good or bad, we don't know, but as we're approaching this kind of an inflection point, I would say, the systems are more and more vulnerable to it. And so the way that we start addressing it is by vocally getting out there and at least trying to make sure that our information, scientific information, is available, and understanding, you know, again, this puts a ton of the burden on scientists, which is one of the problems, right? Is essentially we're always trying to go out and discredit disinformation. But I think if you look at some of the most trusted individuals in conservation, David Attenborough, for instance, Jane Goodall, Sylvia Earle, right? All these people are so incredibly respected that their word is pretty much gospel. And so I think that we need to be building the next generation of scientists into this level of trusted authorities whose reputation is as close to unimpeachable as possible. And now, politicians, news, lobbyists are not against kind of mudslinging by any means, but I think we need to be proactive rather than reactive. And I think that's what we haven't been doing so far. We've been very reactive, responding, back foot, rather than really getting out and driving narratives that are scientifically accurate. Yeah.
So thank you so much. There's been comments online saying that this was such a brilliant talk. Thanks so much for coming today. Thank you so much to Brock.
Thanks so much. Thank you.